Hello and welcome to our Barrier Island lecture, part 2. Today we're going to be focusing on the maritime forests. We'll go over flora and fauna, the ecology and formation of, as well as the salt marsh. And then as you watch this video, please do make sure that you are recording your notes in the Google Doc that's attached to this assignment. So let's get started. So first off, the location. Where is the maritime forest? So in our last time together, we were talking about the intertidal zone and the dunes. The maritime forest will actually come as a result then of those mature dunes. So this is going to be really the center of the island. It is going to be between the sand dune that's going to be on the ocean side and the salt marsh, which is going to be on the bay side. So this is where you're going to have your maritime forest right after the dunes. So again, maritime forests are going to be formed as a result of succession of the dunes. Remember that these barrier islands are always rolling over. So these dunes will eventually turn into these mature forests. At the end of this succession, it is what we know as the climax community. This is going to be organisms that are going to be residing here then that have only been able to be introduced into the area because of all of the work that those pioneer species and secondary species did on developing the soil necessary to allow for these larger vegetative organisms to live here. The stresses, similar to other stresses on the other parts of the barrier island, but there are a few that are going to be different. So the first one here is just space. It is an island, so there is not a whole lot of space that these organisms can actually occupy for themselves. So they're going to have adaptations, especially the plants, that are going to be able to maximize their space so that they can really shade out other organisms and access that sunlight, because not having enough sunlight is one of the stresses of these organisms. The wind as well is going to be a factor. It may not be quite as a factor as it is on the dune side, but they are still going to have abrasive wind. And then access to fresh water. So since they are surrounded by an estuary or the ocean, they're not going to be able to get that fresh water right at the surface of the ground. They're going to have special adaptations to be able to reach the water table underneath. So some of the adaptations they have to deal with those stressors, first, they have to be really fast growing plants. The faster they are, the faster they can shoot up and establish that canopy so that they can have access to the sunlight. They are going to want to not spend a lot of time building mass, so they are going to have thin trunks, and those trunks are going to have then the top heavy trees so that they can have those leaves or pine needles necessary for photosynthesis. Those also then have to be very flexible. So if we think of something that is tall and has most of its weight at the top of that object, it's going to want to bend. And especially since wind is one of the stressors, it has to be able to withstand that high winds. So the other adaptation that it has is it's going to have to make sure that it does have roots that are going to establish its ground. It has to make sure that even though it is flexible, it is not going to come out of the soil. So the fibrous root system is going to help to hold that soil in place and anchor that tree into the ground, as well as the taproot. The taproot's going to be really deep down into that barrier island. And it's going to be deep enough that not only does it help hold the tree up, but it also helps to access that fresh water for that vegetation. If you were to look at this climax community, although you are going to have a lot of those tall trees, and especially on the barrier islands on the Atlantic coast, there are going to be a lot of pines. You do have these shrubs in the front, right at the edge. So that is, again, because of the wind, that is going to be coming off. They're going to have better adaptations to deal with that. But that's also going to be the reason so that they don't need a whole lot of space to be able to anchor themselves. If a tall pine was right here at the edge, it might not stand a chance of being able to support itself. So you have shorter shrub plants right at the edge, and then you have those tall pine plants as you move into the island. Some of the different types of flora plants you're going to see. The loblolly pine that we talked about last time, the sassafras, poison ivy, Virginia creeper, turkey oat, sweet gum trees, and red cedar trees, just to name a few. But there's one here that I wanted to make sure that you knew what this was. So of this list, what is this plant? And you may have heard some sayings like leaves of three, let it be. Or if you see this plant that kind of looks like one of the three leaves has a mitt shape to it, you should know that that is poison ivy. So even if you are not allergic to it now, it does not mean that your immune system is going to change over time. Remember, you have your T-delayed hypersensitivity cells, so they can always pick up this antigen, and then later in life you may end up allergic to poison ivy. Here's the loblolly pine. So again, as you go deeper into the maritime forest, they're going to get taller and thinner with most of their branches right at the top. So this loblolly pine has been known to almost be able to get kind of perpendicular to the ground and still not break. So it does have that very special adaptation of being extremely flexible. So why pines? Many reasons. They're adapted to salinity, so they're not going to dry out or desiccate like other deciduous trees might. So because they have those needles, it is going to expose less surface area to the wind, and therefore transpiration is not going to happen as quickly. So it can hold on to a lot of its moisture without losing it like it would if it was a broad-leafed plant. In addition to just less surface area, it has that waxy coating on the epidermis. It's called the cuticle, and it's going to help to retain water. They're very fast growing. So if you were to plant two different types of trees, the pines tend to have a much quicker rate acceleration of growth. And it is going to have a softer wood, and that softer wood is going to allow for that plant to be much more flexible and be able to bend with the wind. Here's another species. Again, this one does have a mitt shape, so I wanted you to make sure you didn't confuse the two. But this one is going to be a tree, a poison ivy you might find on a tree, but it is going to be like a vine. It's going to be growing on the tree or on the ground. This one also has these three distinct leaves. So it has the mitt, it has one that has like the three lobes to it, and then one that's just kind of a regular lobe. You may have actually had this as a soda. It tastes a lot like root beer. Or maybe even just the tea of this. So this is a sassafras tree. And if you ever do take a leaf and smell it, it is going to smell very similar to a root beer. So other types of fauna then that are going to be living within the maritime forest. You're going to have a lot more larger mammal species, so fox, deer, even the ponies on Assateague and Chincoteague Islands, but also other organisms like some birds or warblers you will find in this maritime forest. Why are they important? Well, like really anywhere, they're going to be an excellent habitat for animals, like the ones that I just mentioned. They're also going to help to buffer winds from the mainland so they can allow, again, for storm events to not have as drastic effect. And they can help stabilize erosion. So you have a lot of those fibrous roots that are going to be from these trees and shrubs, and they're going to help to, again, hold that island together. All right, next one, the salt marsh. The salt marsh is an area that's going to be on that bay side. It's on the back of the island. It's also known as a coastal salt marsh or tidal marsh because, again, this is going to have an intertidal zone for itself. And this is going to be adjacent to the bay side of the intertidal zone. So you have the two different intertidal zones on the ocean and the bay side. This one's going to be right next to the bay side. And a lot of the water here is actually brackish. So brackish is a combination of salt and fresh water. So it's going to get fresh water from precipitation. Precipitation will fall down, as well as access to the watershed from freshwater creeks and lakes. Well, maybe not lakes, but streams and creeks. And it can then regularly be flooded out by those tides. So again, the influence then that the forces and the bodies like the moon has, this water is going to have high tides and low tides on the back of the island. The location. So again, it's on the intertidal zone and it's the bay side, and it's going to be between the bay and the maritime forest. So this is the area then of these salt marsh locations. So you have the tidal zone, the intertidal zone. You're going to have this low marsh that does get flooded at high tide. You have the high marsh that's going to have a lot of these grass species plants, but that does not tend to get flooded out with the tides. And then you have an upper border range that's going to be that edge of the salt marsh. So this one was interesting in terms of the different ways that organisms live in these areas and utilize these areas. So there are lots of breeding grounds that are going to be happening within the salt marsh itself. So even though parts of the salt marsh are anoxic, so they're not going to have really any oxygen in them, there are lots of areas here in which are going to be serving for breeding grounds, for lots of spawning to take place. So a lot of organisms are going to spend their very critical young years in this area because it's not going to have as drastic of a tide as it would on the front of the island. It does tend to have a lot of protection from the wind, from the dunes and the maritime forest. So this is really a pretty stable place for these aquatic organisms and even non-aquatic organisms like birds to lay their young, to lay their eggs, and to begin to raise them here. So these are formed from low wave energy. Again, it's not going to have as drastic of waves or tides as the front of the island. It still then has a lot of detritus and a lot of decomposition of nutrients from the flora that live in this area. And because you have all of this dead organic matter or detritus, it can then form this nutrient-rich hydrolytic soil. So this is going to allow for a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus for other plants to continue to grow. But again, it's going to have a lot of this dead organic matter for lots of macroinvertebrates and insects to be able to eat. And if there are plenty of insects around, then you're going to have lots of those higher order species as they're allowed to be moving up the food chain and eating up the food chain. The vegetation here is going to be different than the ocean side, although the ocean side did have some dune grasses. In this, it's going to be dominated by many different types of grasses, but not dune grasses. These organisms here are going to have different adaptations than the front of the island. So the stress is here. There are tidal flooding. So still you have to have adaptations that can deal with levels of water, whether they're existent or non-existent. There is salt water immersion, so you need fresh water, but you do also have to have adaptations that can account for the salt water. Throughout the day, there's changes in moisture or salinity levels. Especially if you have different tides. So a spring tide versus a neap tide, there's going to be different concentrations of water, of salt in the water, because it is a brackish water, so it's a mix of fresh and salt water. There's going to be low oxygen levels in certain parts of the salt marsh, so therefore you're going to have this anoxic or anaerobic soil without oxygen present. So for the adaptations, The Urahalian species are going to be species that can tolerate this wide range of salinity. So they're going to have mechanisms to eliminate different salt concentrations, but that they're not going to do it at a constant rate, that they're going to be able to fluctuate depending on how much salt is present in the water. They do also tend to have a shell or an exoskeleton, again, to account for those moisture differences. Camouflage is of utmost importance, again, because you have tides, so you're going to be laying exposed for periods of time. Being able to blend into the area is absolutely going to be to your benefit. Or you could burrow, getting away from the top of that mud. You're going to have access to lots of sun and not really a whole lot of shelter. There aren't trees that are going to be growing in this area, so that sun, that solar energy, is going to be something that you need an adaptation for. Many of the organisms are going to feed on this detritus, which is your dead organic waste or debris. And the lack of oxygen in the soil is a problem. So you're going to need some type of aerial roots that are going to allow for you to uptake oxygen from other sources of the environment. So one example of plants, these are your halophytes. These are plants that love salt. So they're going to allow for them to just absorb salt water, and they can store the salt in their roots, and they can use the fresh water in the other areas of the plant. Some examples. You have salt marsh cordgrass. So this is going to grow in that low marsh area. Salt meadow cordgrass or hay, which is going to grow in the high meadow area, not going to be quite as covered as the low area of water. The Phragmites, and I think I mentioned this in the last lecture as well, but unfortunately Phragmites was actually used as shipping crate material in the early 1900s. And since it was just this seed, they threw it into the environment thinking that it was fine. But if you take an organism that is not native and you put it into an area where it doesn't maybe have predators, something that will eat it, or it has adaptations allow for it to better compete other species, this is a problem because this is going to drastically reduce the biodiversity in the area. And if you do not have a high biodiversity, then the ecosystem itself is not going to be able to withstand environmental changes. So there are programs in place to try to rid areas of Phragmites, but it is highly invasive and highly successful. So these are hard to eliminate in most areas. And on to the fauna. So again, breeding grounds for so many different organisms. So insects like the marsh mosquito or other higher vertebrates like this here diamondback terrapin, or other invertebrates like fiddler crab or periwinkle snails, water snakes, herons and egrets. So a lot of birds are going to use this area of the salt marsh for their nesting grounds. And mussels, and we will be talking about mussels and oysters a little bit later, but they are incredibly important to getting rid of toxins as well as other chemicals in the salt water, and they can really recycle a lot of that water to make it pure for all organisms living in the area. Some other types of flora, you have your phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are going to be things like these diatoms, but also algae and this carrageenan. This is like your red algae or red seaweed. This is going to be used for a lot of food. So if you were to look at like the back label of lots of different things, you might actually see this there. So it tends to stabilize food so that it doesn't curdle. It also tends to thicken food so it has a more pleasant taste or feel as you are eating this. And agar, so agar are going to also be a result of these algae products that spend a lot of their time in the salt marsh area. And peat. Peat is very useful. Peat is going to be just that broken down dead organic matter, and this detritus over time, with enough pressure and enough just heat energy, will actually decompose, and you can use peat for fuel. Peat also will eventually turn into coal. And peat is also something that you can find through core samples on the dune side of the island to know and provide evidence of this barrier island rollover. So some more about peat. It is partially decomposed plant matter. This is going to be formed in anoxic soil. So this is going to be broken down by bacteria that do not require oxygen. And because these bacteria do not require oxygen, they tend to use sulfur. And they're going to be using sulfur and putting off sulfur, which is why a lot of the salt marsh, the mud region, is going to smell like rotten eggs. But apparently it is good for the skin with this anoxic bacteria. But peat is going to act like a sponge, so it does help to retain a lot of the water. It does help to alleviate coastal flooding, and again, it's an early stage of coal. So what do salt marshes do? Well, they're going to be able to temper extreme temperatures. Water itself has this wonderful ability to absorb lots of energy without changing temperature. So because you have access to all of this water surrounding the mainland, it's going to help to stabilize those coastal temperatures. Absolutely a nesting or breeding ground for birds, fish, arthropods, and mollusks, because you have these mussels and other filter feeders for water purification. There's going to be lots of different plants that are living in this area, so it's a high productivity area. And that detritus is going to be able to add nutrients to the bay. And if nutrients are there, not only can plants grow, but also you can have those macroinvertebrates and insect larvae in that area. And if they are there, then small fish can eat them and bigger fish can eat them. And it's just going to help to feed that food chain. And then finally, there's a huge ecological significance because this is where the majority of our commercial seafood is going to spend their lives. So if you enjoy some mussels or clams, then most of them are going to spend most of their life in this salt marsh. So without it, you would not have these industries, or you would not have access to those food sources. Okay, well, that's going to end this here. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Take care.